For decades, Mick Hucknall was recognized around the world as the unmistakable voice of Simply Red. With more than 50 million albums sold worldwide, he became one of the most successful British singers of his generation. But behind the music, the fame, and the unforgettable red hair was a much more complicated story. A story filled with childhood pain, loneliness, enormous success, personal excess, addiction, family conflict, regret, and ultimately redemption. This is the story of the man behind Simply Red. Long before the sold-out arenas and international fame, Mick Hucknall was a young boy growing up in Manchester. His childhood was shaped by a painful family separation. According to the account in the source material, his mother, Maureen, left the family when Mick was only 3 years old, leaving his father Reg to raise him. That experience stayed with Mick. Growing up without his mother, he experienced a sense of loneliness that would influence him for years. His father worked hard to provide for him, but the emotional absence of a mother left a lasting impression. Music eventually became Mick's escape. He began writing and expressing his feelings through words. Those early attempts at songwriting would later become the foundation of one of the most successful careers in British pop and soul music. But before Simply Red existed, Mick had to struggle to find his sound. In 1977, he formed the Frantic Elevators, a punk band playing small venues around northern England. The group worked hard, but mainstream success remained out of reach. One song, however, would eventually change everything. Mick had written Holding Back the Years when he was still a teenager. At the time, nobody could have predicted that this deeply personal song would one day become an international anthem. The Frantic Elevators eventually broke up, but Mick refused to abandon music. Instead, he looked in a completely different direction. He became increasingly influenced by American soul, blues, and R&B. He realized that his voice was better suited to emotional, soulful music than the aggressive punk sound he had started with. Then, in 1984, Simply Red was born. Mick assembled a new group of musicians and created a sound centered around his distinctive voice. His appearance also made him instantly recognizable. His curly red hair, unusual clothes, and confident personality helped him stand out in the rapidly changing world of music television. But the voice was what truly captured people's attention. Simply Red's breakthrough came with Money's Too Tight to Mention, which quickly climbed the charts. Suddenly, Mick Hucknall had gone from struggling musician to international star. Then came Holding Back the Years. The song was transformed into a soulful recording, with the heavy guitars stripped away and the emotional melody placed front and center. When the song reached #1 on the US Billboard Hot 100 in 1986, everything changed. Mick was only 25. A song connected to his difficult childhood had become a global hit. Millions of listeners heard the emotion in his voice, but success also brought a new lifestyle. Private jets, luxury hotels, huge parties, constant attention, and an endless stream of people surrounding him. For Mick, the sudden transformation was enormous. He had grown up in working-class Manchester, and now he was living a life that seemed almost impossible compared with his childhood. But fame didn't automatically erase old wounds. As Simply Red became bigger, Mick's personal life became increasingly public. His relationships attracted enormous attention, and tabloids followed his every move. The source material describes a period when Mick became known for an extremely active romantic life. Years later, he publicly expressed regret about the way he behaved during those years and apologized to women who had been affected by his actions. Looking back, the story became more complicated than simple celebrity excess. Mick eventually recognized that his constant search for attention may have been connected to deeper feelings of insecurity and rejection. The more famous he became, the more attention he received. Yet the attention never seemed to completely fill the emotional gap he had carried since childhood. And then came another chapter. Simply Red's success continued into the 1990s, with the album Stars becoming a huge commercial achievement. But the enormous success came with an exhausting schedule of touring, recording, and performing. The pressure eventually took a toll. According to the source material, Mick struggled with heavy drinking from 1996 through 2001. On stage, audiences could still see the powerful singer they knew. Behind the scenes, however, his drinking was affecting his personal life and well-being. The contrast was striking. Millions of people saw the superstar. Few saw the struggle. Then another painful part of his past returned to the headlines. Mick's mother, Maureen, eventually spoke publicly about the circumstances surrounding her departure from the family. Her version of events challenged the story Mick had carried with him throughout his life. She reportedly argued that she had not simply abandoned her son, but had left a difficult marriage. The dispute reopened old wounds. For Mick, this wasn't merely another celebrity controversy. It involved his childhood, his memories, and the emotional foundation behind some of his most personal music. The media naturally focused on the possibility of a dramatic reunion. But Mick reportedly did not want to participate. For him, reconciliation was not something that could simply be created for television cameras or newspaper headlines. Sometimes, family relationships remain complicated. Sometimes there is no perfect ending. And sometimes healing means accepting that certain relationships may never become what you wish they could be. Mick eventually had to confront another important question. What kind of life did he actually want? He had already achieved what most musicians could only dream of. But money couldn't guarantee happiness. Fame couldn't erase loneliness. And relationships couldn't permanently solve emotional pain. Eventually, Mick began building a different kind of life. Away from the constant pressure of the music industry, he became involved in business and property. The source material describes his investments in real estate, a winery in Sicily and an estate in Ireland. These projects gave him something music had sometimes failed to provide: the sense of control and purpose. He could work on something outside the entertainment industry. He could build. He could create. And he could live without constantly being surrounded by the chaos of celebrity life. Then came a major decision. After decades of success, Mick decided to bring Simply Red's original era to an end. The band embarked on a farewell tour in 2010, eventually concluding the journey at London's O2 Arena. For many fans, it felt like the end of an era. But for Mick, it was also the beginning of something new. Away from the non-stop touring lifestyle, he had more time to focus on himself and his family. In 2010, he married Gabriella Westbury. They later welcomed their daughter, Romy True. Fatherhood gave Mick a completely different perspective on family. He had grown up experiencing the pain of separation. Now he had the opportunity to create the stable family environment he had once wanted for himself. That became one of the most meaningful transformations in his life. The man who had spent years chasing fame, attention, and excitement eventually found value in something much quieter: family, stability, and time. But the story didn't end there. The stage eventually called him back. Simply Red returned for anniversary performances, and Mick once again found himself standing in front of enormous crowds. The comeback became a full-circle moment. The young singer from Manchester who once struggled to get noticed had survived decades of changing musical trends, personal controversy, and enormous pressure. And his voice remained at the center of it all. What makes Mick Hucknall's story so compelling isn't simply the success of Simply Red. It's the contrast. A boy who grew up with emotional pain became a world-famous singer. A young man searching for acceptance became an international celebrity. A superstar who appeared to have everything still struggled privately. A man who battled destructive habits eventually found stability. And someone who spent years surrounded by crowds eventually learned the value of a quieter life. His story also reminds us that celebrities are rarely as simple as the image presented to the public. Behind the photographs, interviews, and performances are real people carrying memories, mistakes, regrets, and hopes. Mick Hucknall's journey was far from perfect. There were choices he later regretted. There were relationships that could not be repaired. There were years when fame and excess took him in dangerous directions. But there was also change. There was self-reflection. There was family. And there was a return to the music that had changed his life. Today, Mick Hucknall's legacy is not simply about the millions of records sold or the countless performances. It is about the songs that connected with people. Songs created from experiences that were deeply personal to him but somehow became universal for millions of listeners. Holding back the years began as the expression of a teenager trying to process his complicated family life. Decades later, it became one of Simply Red's signature songs. That transformation says something powerful about music. Sometimes the pain we experience privately can become the art that helps somebody else survive their own pain. Mick Hucknall's story is ultimately a story about transformation. From Manchester to the world's biggest stages. From punk clubs to international fame. From excess to reflection. From loneliness to family. And from one of the most turbulent periods of his life to a quieter chapter where he could finally appreciate what mattered most. The voice that once filled massive arenas still carries the history of everything he experienced. And perhaps that's why Simply Red's music continues to resonate. Because behind the polished melodies was always something real. A complicated life. A complicated family. A complicated man. But also a remarkable survivor. After everything Mick Hucknall experienced, one thing became clear: success isn't necessarily about having everything. Sometimes, success is finally understanding what you actually need. For Mick, that meant music, family, peace, and the freedom to live life on his own terms. And that may be the most important chapter of his story.